So, hey everyone, and welcome to this session called Building a Paper Trail, and a subtitle on how to secure and audit a public cloud. So basically what we're going to check here is how to log stuff from two different environments, so from vCloud Director and vSphere-based clouds, how to monitor them, how to implement security systems, and how to do login information. So my name is Rock, my last name is Orsic. I work for OVH as a consulting cloud architect. What does that mean? Basically, I work with technical services. I help customers design solutions and implement them and work on their use cases.
I like to say that he's free PSO. It's part of support. I am a technical product manager for OVH. Both of us were formerly with vCloud Air. So this is a solution that is going to span two different areas. It's a hosted vSphere cloud and a hosted vCloud Director cloud. The idea is when you have hosted stacks and the provider owns the lower section of it, including things like ESXi root, vSphere SSO admin, and more, when they lock that down so they can provide it as a hosted service, what can you still do to secure that environment? And more specifically, how can you make sure that you are building that full audit paper trail that you're going to need later on to be able to prove compliance and help mitigate issues down the line? It becomes a challenge for many of our customers that we see, or it's a common question, because all of a sudden they aren't the admin of the entire stack. They're sharing that with a provider. So when you can't get there, what can you get to? How can you manage that? And how can you get around some of those limitations? So we'll start with the VMworld disclaimer, the normal. We're not really going over new features here, to be honest, so we'll skip through pretty quickly. We're going to start with a bit of an introduction, kind of just frame this conversation, some of the objectives and what our starting clouds are going to look like, again, on a vCloud Director-based environment that's more of a multi-tenant type solution versus a vSphere as a service environment. Then we'll move on to our solution that we're building out layer by layer to different pieces. What do we recommend? What's best practice that we've seen in our several years of being cloud providers on these platforms? And then we'll go through some attack scenarios and show you how we can work through that with the solutions that we provided. We're going to be pretty demo heavy here, so we'll be cutting back and forth between a number of videos and some of our initial points. And of course, at the end, we'll have time for Q&A. So if you do have any other questions or need more information, we can dive into that. So with that, let's dive right into objectives and go quickly. So to set the stage, everyone has the same common types of requirements. So of course, these should be normal terms, that you're likely following some sort of onion model of security. The idea that you are layering multiple forms of security in front of your systems to be able to protect them so that if one fails, you have another behind it. So what we're going to be layering here is a service of network security, systems security, logging, auditing, monitoring, all that together. We're also going to be working off the idea of a least privilege model. We're going to archive everything as long as possible, and we'll talk about some of that and pulling that out of a cloud, mostly because cloud providers tend to only keep logs for the minimum that they need to. We see across the industry that 30 days is fairly standard for keeping local logs for tenant instances, just because they may need that for troubleshooting purposes, but they don't need to archive your user actions and other items for years to go back to that. That's a lot of extra overhead for them. So typically you're looking at about 30 days. That's not enough for most companies from a security standpoint. We're also going to look at a bit of anomaly detection to be able to see when there is a problem and follow that kind of tracking so that you can fight issues later on. With that, we'll be building through our layers bit by bit. From the outside, we'll start with role-based access control, talking about some of your options. Again, when you don't have SSO admin, or you don't have a system admin right in vCloud Director, you're more limited. So how do you control your access in? What options are going to be available to you? And what would we recommend from there, not just on a systems access and user access, but also to resource access from more of a governance sort of idea. Below that, we'll go through network security, system security solution, audit logging and archiving, and then we'll finish up with our solutions with that active mitigation and investigation. So Rock will jump into what our cloud structure actually looks like here.
So what does actually change when you opt for a cloud solution? Let's take a look at a few bullet points. So the first issue that everybody is going to encounter is the loss of control. Of course, when you are managing just the VMs and networks, you're not managing the underlying infrastructure, you're not managing, for instance, vSphere, you only have access to VM management. And with that, you lose a lot of control and you lose options to use management software. So if you use any third-party management software that requires installation of agents, that might be an issue in a cloud provider.
Now, the one thing is customers do give up the loss of control to go to cloud because then you get the agility and you get to focus then more on operational costs versus CapEx. You're not worrying about the hardware because the cloud provider is. So there are benefits with what you are giving up.
Exactly. And with the cloud solutions, you also have limited visibility on how the underlying infrastructure is set up. For instance, in a vCloud Director-based environment, you will not know how many hosts is providing that environment. While on a vSphere-based, you will see that. So based on that, you also need to consider how are you going to leverage cloud for your use case. The next one is how cloud computing fits into a given access model. You'll probably know that you'll use some options for your role-based access control. For instance, you might be only, a provider might restrict the amount of characters that are available for passwords. Or it might enforce different policies that are not compliant with your internal policies. Also, if you have, for instance, multi-factor authentication, or if or you want to use federation, that might be an issue when you are moving to the cloud. But there are ways how to get around it. And that's one of the key ideas of this presentation.
And get around it from a management model, not necessarily get around it from an attack model.
Exactly. Okay, and as discussed, you might have a limited amount of tools available for cloud environments. For instance, not all logging solutions might be supported. Or if we look at vCloud Director logging, there is no way that a tenant can actually connect logs. Well, in a vSphere-based environment, that is not such a problem.
So there tends to be a spectrum that on the far end you have bare metal cloud services where they are simply providing the metal and then they're installing a full vSphere stack on that and then you get control of everything in the access because they're just a hardware provider. And then you go through the stack to partially manage to where they give you some access but they lock down again, possibly vSphere SSO admin. They might retain the management network on a different area of the environment or lock down some of the access to that entirely. But still you have most of the admin rights and roles to the system. And that goes on the far side to a black box solution to where you get to see next to nothing. You may not even have API access, which can limit you down. So we're somewhere on that spectrum. We're going to kind of aim for a middle of the road solution for what we're talking about today. All right, now with the limitations, we are going to focus on the API where possible. That, yes, there are some black box solutions where you don't have access, but that is rare. To be completely transparent here. So the API where possible or the SDK should be available in some form and that should give you most of the access that you need. So for vCloud Director, most features that they add to vCloud Director as a platform hit the API first before the UI has an option for it and before they map it to a role fully in that web interface. So you can actually be more productive and do more with the API. So we're going to focus on that first in our solutions where possible to use integration points. We're also going to, of course, work within the boundaries, but we're going to centralize where possible because you don't want to have 4 different logging solutions across 4 different clouds. You want to make sure that you have a centralized solution that can scale as you start to scale out these environments, especially in what is now a multi-cloud world where you could be working with several providers offering similar services but with their various perks. And within the VMware Service Provider Program, there's over 4,000 providers. And you could hit one to run within a region, say within Africa or India or Canada, and then you could hit a separate one to run within separate regions for the US, for Singapore, for EMEA. So we want to make sure we centralize that as much as possible. We're going to pull and archive the activity away from the cloud as much as we can too. Most of our customers that we see are running in a hybrid model. You've likely been hearing about hybrid cloud for years. So we're going to focus on keeping that management on-prem, not just from a management ease perspective, but also from a data sovereignty and data privacy perspective to make sure that then you are subject just to your own privacy rules and regulations within your country or your area, and you're not worried about that data being replicated to multiple regions, multiple countries, multiple zones that could subject them to things like the Patriot Act or other such regulations. So keeping those logs and those activities where your local laws are. And then we're going to automate. We need this to scale. The cloud is a fast-moving business. It is there to provide agility, and we want to be able to scale with it. So in order to scale, we need to simplify and automate where possible.
So the tools that we'll focus on for this presentation, since this is VMworld, everything is going to be more or less VMware-based. We're going to show vSphere and vCloud Director-based clouds. We're going to check NSX, Log Insight, VRA, VRO, and in some cases we'll also introduce some third-party appliances like HITRUST for encryption. Snort could be one of them, but it's not covered today, and some antivirus options that also will not cover today.
Yeah, we only have about 45 minutes. This could be hours long as a presentation. We went into the details, so we'll try to get technical. We'll aim mostly for best practice recommendations, and we'll show you what we feel is most important here. We do have customers that don't run an IDS solution, IPS solution like Snort. That's fine. You can get by without it. It'd be better with it. And then AV, of course, there's many options. So we'll focus on the other pieces. Now with the platforms we have today, we're going to be looking at a VCD-based environment like on the left here. Anything that's in gray is something that you do not have access to. So for a VCD-based environment, you can't get to vSphere, you can't see it. So you are restricted to just the VCD itself, to the NSP, which is going to be some sort of an abstract layer of your networking. This can either be contained within vCloud Director in some versions, or it's separate in others to make sure that you can get to NSX or vShield, depending on how far back we're going. So you have some network access, you have some VCD access for your compute resources, and then you're going to have a cloud provider UI of some form in front of it. It may or may not have an API. In this case, there's a very limited one that we're going to stay away from there, and we'll focus more on VCD. Now the vSphere environment opens us up a little bit more. We'll focus on a hyper-converged solution. So this will be similar to the VCF ones you'll be hearing about, or what we run on OVH today. And this will be a vSphere-based cloud where you do have that access to a point. You have an admin, but no SSO admin. You do have NSX administrative rights. But you still can't get to the hardware, you don't have ESXi root, you can't get to the management network because that has to be contained for the hosting provider to manage your upgrades, your patching, and the base maintenance of the underlying environment. With that, most providers are going to pitch what they call a shared security model of some kind. So that's going to be a split of what you're responsible for versus what they're responsible for. Now, they're typically on the bottom going to provide your physical infrastructure, and with that, of course, redundancy, but from a security side, they will offer that physical security, and that's where you're looking for some of those compliance certs with the ISO, SOX, HIPAA, PCI, and so on, that they are meeting certain regulations for physical and system security up to a certain level. But with those certs to a cloud provider, they're only responsible to a certain level, and it's shared security, so you're responsible for everything above a certain line. Now, in what we're going to be focusing on today, we'll have from the virtual machines upward. So that's going to be your VM data, your tenant network, but not necessarily data center network. Of course, the items where you are responsible for your own data and your own systems, separate from theirs. So we'll focus on that. No vCenter access in the VCD one, but still access to your systems, your operating system control, network, portal, some of those other items. And with that, you're responsible for your own employees as well and how they act in your system. So let's jump into the solution.
Okay, so let's dig into the first solution detail. We're going to take a look at role-based access control first. So as discussed before, when you move to the cloud, there are some limitations on how you're going to access this cloud and how users are going to authenticate into those clouds. If we compare vCloud Director and vSphere options, now keep in mind that with vSphere, role-based access control is limited to SSO administrator. Usually cloud providers won't give you access to SSO administrator because that means that the tenant would have access to everything, which limits the options of role-based access control. So at the moment, majority of vSphere-based clouds do not support options to connect your own Active Directory into them. So you are more limited to local users. And auditing for authentication of users is done on the vSphere UI, or if you connect Log Insight. Now, since you have vSphere access, you usually have access to vSphere API, so you can connect Log Insight directly and get the full log bundle. Now, on vCloud Director stack, things are a little bit different. vCloud Director was envisioned as a multi-tenant environment, So customers can connect their ADFS providers or any other directory provider through federation services, so through SAML. This can be ADFS, it can be Okta, it can be whatever it works with OAuth too.
And it's crazy how easy it is on vCloud
Yeah.
Director. It's so simple to federate to your local environment, and we'll go into a few more details here.
And what you get with that is basically then you take the control of how your users are going to be authenticating from the provider back into your on-prem. So you can configure login times, you can configure the amount of time passwords are valid and stuff like that. You can even configure multi-factor authentication. But on the other side, what vCloud Director is missing, it's logging. So again, if you want to audit those logins, you are limited just to VCD UI or to REST. The problem here is that the logs will get truncated after some time based on the provider settings. So we'll talk about this a little bit more into detail later. So if we check how this identity federation actually works, in this case with vCloud Air. So a user would navigate to a vCloud Air website. vCloud Director would then push the authentication to a corporate identity provider. User logs in. How this login works is it can be with Touch ID or with a password. After that, identity provider posts SAML assertion into vCloud Director. vCloud Director grants access for the user, and user gets access to the vCloud Director portal.
So, I guess running back to this quick, the recommendation here is where possible to use an identity provider and keep your passwords and your policy on-prem. So this is where if you have vCloud Director, it's fairly easy in most of those clouds to be able to configure this. It's really you copy and paste a certificate from your IDP into the VCD portal in a federation section, and that allows it to accept SAML tokens from your identity provider system. In this way, your passwords stay on-prem, so they are not up in the cloud in any form. All of that is held on-prem. It means your management is held on-prem as well, so that if you unfortunately need to let an employee go or fire them for whatever reason, then you only have one place to remove their access rather than having to do that on-prem and in a cloud. Now, when you don't have this, you have to fall back on standard RBAC of whatever predefined roles were created in the cloud. Now, in the vSphere cloud that we're presenting the solution for today, that's a case where today you want to focus on those roles and providing least access there as possible, typically by assigning only admins to have access to the main portal, to vSphere, to the other pieces, and then providing just RDP access or SSH access in across a VPN. Otherwise, that allows you to limit and still control from on-prem, but where possible, if you are given the option of either SSO full access and federation or from VCD doing that identity federation, this is of course going to be the best practice solution. And that's going to give us that first full layer to allow you to really manage that end user segregation and limitation, and also provide, we'll get into governance a little bit more later, but this ties into part of that conversation. Okay, moving past that to the next level, we need to make sure that we ensure network security. So here we're going to lean on in the VCD environment and both in a vSphere environment. And these days, it's going to be typically an edge gateway. Now, you do have some providers that allow you access to physical networking equipment. But honestly, from what we've seen, NSX is the superior solution here. Just because it allows you then to be able to scale the networking, it gives you more advanced features, and it can actually work faster than some of the physical equipment can, especially in data centers where you may be in a multi-tenant solution. So you and several other users are sharing that equipment, even though you're only getting a bit of tenant access to see your rules and your pieces of it. So we're going to recommend to take advantage of an edge gateway-based service that these days is going to be NSX, typically in a vSphere environment. So where you do see VCF or a hyper-converged solution or just vSphere with NSX, that's going to give you some of that optimal control. And on top of that, we would be looking towards the distributed firewall, so that micro-segmentation piece to be able to provide more of that security where it can be a bit more scalable with your system. Now, I'll be honest, it takes a long time to set up the distributed firewall properly with rules that can start to scale with your environment, but the time input starts to be worth it down the line once you start to grow. So there's an upfront investment to help you move faster later on. The biggest piece of this that some customers miss, now it's not just a standard firewall, it is a NIC level firewall, at the VNIC. So what actually happens is the traffic is dropped at the NIC, the VNIC, before the customer or the machine ever sees it. This allows you to secure it in a way that customers can't get to. Only admins, only from a specific angle of vSphere are allowed to provide this to your VMs, and it then can silently drop or allow traffic outside of most malicious attacks. So it allows you to be slightly more secure than you would see with other firewall types. And this is the main selling feature. I've had customers come to me and ask, why do they need NSX beyond this? Now, there are other benefits and other things that it can apply and add for you, but from a security perspective especially, this is a very unique piece of the product and of the market. So just to show a little bit about what this can do for you, let's kick up a bit of a demo. So on the network security side, what we're showing off here, going to be 2 VMs. These are just Photon VMs for now, but they're going to be on the same subnet. So you have .10 and .11. Same subnet, same area, same network or virtual switch, virtual wire. So the first VM, .10, it's going to ping the gateway, ping goes through. It pings the machine beside it, .11, ping goes through, everything's fine. Next VM beside it is going to be .1, nothing. He can't ping the gateway, he can't ping the previous VM because of how we set up these rules to define east-west traffic on the same subnet, as well as what can also be north-south. This is part of that distributed firewall, so it is distributed across the host, it is on a VNIC level for it. What we're going to look at here is managing this from a grouping object and a security tag perspective. So this allow ping rule only allows pings for anything with a security tag that is applied to it. So in this case, if we go back to the VM, we see that, well, that security group only contains the one VM, we can add the other VM into it. And this way it is recognized from the virtual machine, not by IP, which can then be attacked and duplicated and masked as needed, but we can do it from an actual VM standpoint from a specific tag that only the proper NSX admin can get to, locking down control and then allowing us again to scale based on metadata tags or other items that we can have in the environment to be able to follow that. So the important piece here is that we can control that outside of where the normal user is, outside of attacks, and this is available, of course, with vSphere, as the NSX solution, but it's also available on vCloud Director now. So vCloud Director, all environments across the board, at least from the 8.0 or 8.x versions for most cloud providers are going to be running NSX in the background. And with that, they'll either have direct access to it with, and from 8.20 onward, that's with part of the new HTML5 interface piece of that, so you can manage it faster and a little bit easier from there. Or you will have a network service provider portal. We were using one of those on vCloud Air to be able to provide access into more of those services. Oh, so covering this, we're going to recommend from a network security side on the cloud, since you don't have access to the network equipment, we want you to have a distributed solution. We want it to scale. We want it to integrate with your environment, and NSX is going to be the solution here that we'll recommend. So where that's an upgrade that's available with some providers, or where you can get access down to, especially the microsegmentation piece, that's going to be best practice from a security standpoint for our customers across both VCD and vSphere-based clouds. And that'll build on the other security layers that we've already provided.
So what about other security, like system security? Another big problem is how to encrypt the VMs at rest. So as you know, up to vSphere 6.5, there was no native encryption in vSphere or VCD. VCD still doesn't support encryption at rest, even though vSphere 6.5 supports it.
But so even then, you don't see many service providers with 6.5, especially, well, with VCD, but otherwise just because of they typically lag behind the market in terms of upgrades of all the systems, because they need to make sure everything is compatible before they upgrade it. So if you have a hyper-converged solution, you need to make sure that it's not just vSphere, but NSX, vSAN, any other integration points, if they have other systems like VROPs and such that they're using with it, that all of them are compatible. So on a line from VMware, you see vSphere upgraded first, then the other product lines follow for compatibility. Then the service provider needs to test them in their own architecture to make sure they fit. Then they can roll it out globally on their scale as they need to. So they tend to lag behind a little bit, which means even with vSphere clouds, there may be some providers that don't have the latest and greatest, especially versions like, say, 6.5, even when it's been several months since the release, or a year at this point.
So to solve this problem, we can actually take a look at third-party providers like HITRUST, or you can also use OS-level solutions like BitLocker if you want to. Another thing that you need to think about is what to do with antivirus solutions. Now, because the control is taken away from you on the host level, you probably won't be able to use some of the solutions that integrate with vSphere directly, but you'll have to use something that works on the OS level. Same goes with compliance software. For instance, TrustPoint or Tanium are just an example of a compliance software. Additionally, what you'll need to do is you will have to run some sort of periodic testing to ensure that your environment is secure. You can do that with a third-party software like Nessus or something else.
You typically do it through a third-party security company as well. I used to be one of those pen testers. So our software of choice for that was Nessus to start, and then another suite of security tools to be able to test out the system. But to keep up with compliance and the auditing that you're going to see with many standards, you may have to keep up, of course. There's going to be third-party companies that you need to make sure can come in. Now, one of the caveats or the points there is that cloud providers typically don't like you testing against the cloud because it shows up as an attack from their systems from when they're scanning. So if you are going through this, the best case is to notify them ahead of time that you are going to be working through a test for compliance at a certain period of time, just so they can track it and they're not artificially blocking some of the systems and in ways that could negate part of your audit.
So what is HITRUST and how it actually works? Well, basically HITRUST enables you to encrypt your VMs. You can encrypt them on the VM decay level, so basically OS level for a specific drive, or you can actually encrypt the bootloader as well, and just to boot the VM you will then need to enter the password. Now it supports FIPS approved AIS 128-265 encryption for data in motion and at rest. So data is constantly encrypted. It is deployed in a multi-node way. So each of its nodes, it's perfectly contained environment. So if you have a multi-node deployment, all but one node can fail, and you will still be able to log in to your VMs. And there are options to decrypt VMs even if you lose all of the nodes. One really important thing is that it's completely cloud agnostic, and the encryption travels with a VM. So it doesn't matter if you move a VM from your vSphere environment into vSphere as a service environment or to vCloud Air, encryption will go with the VM. Okay? We'll see that later when we'll have an actual schematic how it works. So it does on-the-fly encryption and rekey. It supports AIS-NI hardware acceleration, so it's pretty fast and it doesn't impact the performance of VMs. Basically, it's not actually the performance. It's not impacted at all, and it supports forensic rate logging. So how does this look like if we check the environment? So here you actually have a multi-node cluster. So we have an on-prem environment. Does this have a
laser pointer?
So we have an on-prem environment, and we have an OVH SDDC private cloud. We have a multi-node deployment of HITRUST. We have 2 running in our on-prem data center and 2 running in vSphere as a service. So what does these guys do? Basically, they exchange information about encryption. So an admin logs in and sets encryption rules and policies. And it does that on one of them, and all of them know about encryption services. And then you basically encrypt VMs on-prem. If you move them across into the environment, the encryption will follow.
Now the key here is keys. So when you're providing that system security, and especially from a data at rest perspective, you want to make sure that you as the customer own the keys. If you provide those keys to your provider to be able to decrypt the VMs and manage it, then if the provider is compromised, then so are your systems, and the encryption has done nothing. So you need to make sure that you are in control of those, and if you are having your provider encrypt on your behalf, most systems, if they do it, say, at the array level, they own the array, they manage that. So we need a way to abstract that out so that you have control, in the same way that with network security we need to abstract out the network management with something like NSX to provide software networking. Here we abstract out the encryption to a software-based solution. High Trust is one that we've seen be very successful with a number of our customers, which is why we're pitching it. We're not paid for it, but it is one that provides a lot of control, and we especially like the clustered capacity and how customers can move to and from with this, and they can still control the keys. And again, scale is what we were looking at. So you can scale out by adding more appliances to more environments around the globe, and that allows you to keep that uptime with that piece of security, especially which most compliance is going to require some form of encryption. Now, of course, there's a lot more to system security. Yes, we did just barely touch on AV and host IDS and some other items you'd want to look at, but we feel this is one of the most important. This is a problem that most of our customers ask about, is that encryption at rest, because it's a common issue across the board when you don't own the SAN. Now, governments. Once you have the base set of security for your environment, in terms of your network and your systems, in terms of your user access, we built that base layer or layers. We need to start to control our environment usage. So when you're going to be auditing your environment later on, if you have an issue or if you need to for compliance, you need to be able to prove who does what, that you have least security, and you also need to make sure that from a governance standpoint, your resources are being used as efficiently as possible. So the multiple forms of auditing your environment, resource usage is one of them. So we're going to want to, in this case, I'm going to pitch vRealize automation. Now I understand for those that may have used it or tried it before, maybe looking into it now may have it, it is a complicated solution. That's because it can do a lot. It's more of a framework that then can be customized extensively to be able to provide a number of features, primarily focused on governance. In this case too, we get a bonus from a logging perspective that it gives you a self-service portal, of course, to where you can restrict user access to certain actions on top of VM deployments and resources. But it also logs every action that every user does indefinitely. It keeps a record of those. Those records are searchable from within the audit log of the product itself, or they can be exported from the database. In this way, when you have an issue later from a user access perspective or whatever else may have happened, if they could even get to that point when this is your primary portal, you have a trail that you can follow as part of it. Now, this is a piece of multiple trails we'll show you here going further on. Now, beyond that, it also gives you approval policies for VMs to make sure that customers can only request what you want them to, that you have visibility into that. It provides lifecycle management so that you can make sure VMs aren't left out there indefinitely. So when users or dev teams come to you to request a system, great, they start using it, you can make sure there's a timer on that system. So after a while, they have to continually keep requesting to keep it online, or those resources are recovered to be put towards other projects. This way you don't end up with phantom VMs 5 years down the line that no one can identify who used it, what it's there for, what application is on it. You can log all of those details. Question?
So it's one more acronym, so there is one. What is XaaS?
XaaS is what they pitch as second day operations or anything as a service, the X to mark in for anything. The idea here is that VRA has two engines in it. One of them is a deployment engine, which handles the deployment of virtual machines across multiple clouds. The other is really vRealize Orchestrator. And vRealize Orchestrator is a orchestration engine that provides you with the ability to write scripts, and in this case provide that script as a button to a user in a catalog to perform an action. And it's any action that can go against any system as long as that system has an API. So at the base, Orchestrator has a REST API and a SOAP API plugin where you can write calls against any system. And then they've opened it up to other developers and products to be able to provide their own plugins. Of course, we have vSphere and vCloud Director, but then there are plugins for Cisco equipment, for example, and other products and appliances out there. So with that, you can build any action as long as you could script it. You put it in a button, you provide that button in a catalog to your user so they can reset a password against an Active Directory script that you have. So your help desk is limited to that only during business hours from 8 to 5 when they're in front of it, and only with the people that have access to that type of catalog. So you can really restrict actions and usage on your environment beyond just the logging and other bonuses and capabilities, which is part of where it's a powerful platform, but it's typically recommended to have PSO there to help put it into place. So let's show just a little bit about what some of that may look like, just to illustrate the point here. So it's a little small, but if we go into a catalog administration, we can show that we have a catalog item. that is going to deploy a VM, and it's going to, at the most, allow a user to request 2 VMs. So you see the catalog, they click I want to deploy to SDDC, this could say deploy to Amazon or anywhere else. They try to request more than the limit, it's going to stop them. So they can't request a massive VM, they can't request a ton of them at a time. They go down below the VM, it allows it to them, but you can see that it's pending approval. So a manager would then have to come in, or 2 out of 3 managers, or multiple people in the company, and they would have to, however you need to, come in, give a reason for approval, and approve that VM before it would be provisioned. The other part of this, again, from a lifecycle management, it is given directly to the user. They would have access to that VM. Again, that was very quick to illustrate a point, but in the sake of time, we sped it up. But we have users on this just because it controls every aspect of deployment and it ensures compliance too. So one of our top users on our cloud platform today is using this against vCloud Director. What happens is they have their users or their dev teams, they have access to a pool of resources that is managed from here. So they can only use so much based on a budgeting reason in a cloud. From there, a user can go in and select from a catalog of options that have been pre-approved or may have additional approvals. Again, you have that extra control. When a developer clicks a button to request a machine, they can request within boundaries. And then it starts to provision if they're allowed to within the boundaries. Now in this case, for this given customer, it first goes to a script to generate a host name for the VMs based on what type of VMs they are, what location they're going to. Once it has a host name, it can then go to an IPAM system and reserve an IP address for them. It brings that back with that anything as a service engine. Again, there's an IPAM plugin, so it pulls that back. We have a host name, we have an IP address, we have the specifics of how it should look, and we have a destination that they chose. It goes to that destination, it provisions the machine with the IP address, with the host name, and then it starts to install the middleware on it with a Puppet plugin and integration. So from there we can make sure it's up to compliance there. And again, this is compliance focused, so if any one of those steps fails, there's no IP addresses, we don't have the resources available, whatever it is along that step, it will destroy the machine before it's provided to the user. To make sure that we are only providing machines that are compliant to our users, to make sure we are keeping up with whatever standards we need. Now again, not just that, but we are making sure that we are meeting our auditing guidelines from there, because we are keeping a record of every user that requested anything, of every error that was thrown when one of those systems could not follow one of those steps for any reason. And there's alerting and thresholds and other items built in. It is a very powerful platform. It can help to control provisioning, security, access, a catalog. And there's a lot of, again, upfront cost to be able to program it to these systems, to those integration points, but then it can help you scale a lot later because it is more automation based from there on out.
Okay, so this was governance. Let's move on to logging. So for this presentation, we're just going to touch logging, and we're only going to use Log Insight, but you could use any other syslog. You could use Logstash or anything else. So we already discussed that logging in cloud environments is usually limited to to the tenants. So in VCD, you can only see tasks and events, and you actually don't know how long these tasks and events will be available. This is specified by your cloud provider. With vSphere, you have more access. You usually have access to NSX logs. You have access to all the logs that are available inside vCenter. But keep in mind that these logs are, again, accessible in majority they're accessible from the UI. Now, with VCD, we can actually, the only way to get logs is actually just through UI or API. But there is a way around it. So what you can do is you can write a PowerShell script, and we actually did that. So if anybody needs it later, we can share it. So it's a PowerCLI script that constantly checks the logs via REST API and uses a helper VM to push the logs via ingestion API into Log Insight. And this way you can then store the logs indefinitely based on your requirements. So how does this look from a schema perspective? So we have Log Insight running somewhere, and then we have a helper VM that's doing REST API pulls. It's pulling the logs, and the same action is then pushing the logs into Log Insight via ingestion API. Now, in addition to that, in vCloud Director-based environments, we can also set syslog for edge gateways, but that's about it. And later on, when we'll see the demos, you will see that there is a major difference between the amount of logs that you can store from a vSphere-based cloud or from the logs that you can do on a SDDC as a service-based logs. Okay, so let's move on to 2 demos. So here we have a first demo where administrator is going to delete a VM. So we can see that this is a vSphere-based cloud. The VM is being powered off. It's going to be deleted just now. Okay, and if we go into vCenter view, we can see all the logs under tasks and events. We know who deleted it and when it deleted it. Okay. Now Log Insight, because you have access to vSphere API, integrates directly as you would be running it on-prem. It doesn't matter that it's running in the cloud. You probably won't see ESXi logs, but you see everything that vCenter has to offer. And a user logs in, checks for the VM, checks for when it was deleted, and they can actually see which user deleted it. Now, if we move on to the vCloud Director-based logging, we can see that this is going to work a little bit different. So this is an ADFS-based logging into environment, and rogue admin is going to go and delete a VM. And we'll see that the logs are then being shown in the UI, and that the helper VM is actually pushing those logs into Log Insight. Yeah, it's a little bit fast, but we really don't have enough time for everything. So, okay, this is now Log Insight. With the help of a PowerCLI script, we can get the logs into it. If I do a search here for a removed VM, you're going to see that I actually can view the logs for that. So there it is. We can see that that administrator at OVH.com removed this. Okay, so if we move on now.
Okay, so we ran through those demos. I do want to stop there for a second. He did mention that we had to write a script to be able to pull some of that out of VCD because there's not as much of a native integration as we'd like. So if you do want that script, you are running on a VCD-based cloud today, then we would be happy to provide it to give you a starting point. With that, just let us know after the show and we can give it to you with no guarantees, no licenses, but you can do what you want with it to be able to provide that kind of functionality. But the idea here is we need to pull out logs somewhere. We want them centralized. We would like them in a system back on-prem. Log Insight can provide that with a great searching capacity to be able to manage it. And again, that archival piece. So you always have a record, or you can set your retention on that record of what's happening in your environment rather than losing that 30 days after that VM was deleted. Which it may take that time to catch it on certain test dev systems or other items that may not have needed to be deleted or whatever it would have been based on whatever the attack was. So this provides us the ability to do that, pull it in, centralize it, and do it on a system that we trust and that a VMware convention we can pitch. But moving on to another solution here, once we have some of the logging in place, we also want the monitoring. And my pitch of choice, again, VMware convention, we're going to lean towards a VMware solution. But beyond that, VROPS provides more than just monitoring. It provides anomaly detection, which is important. You want to look for that in your security or your monitoring solution. The idea that it will figure out what the baseline is, what normal is for your environment, and it won't just report when you're over a threshold, it will report when it's over a threshold and it's acting strange, when it's not normal. Because none of us, if you're an admin in the audience, likes to be woken up at 2 a.m. every day of the week by the same alert that's being thrown that the monitoring team won't change the threshold on. In this case, it'll learn that the backup runs every night at that time, and that's why it's throwing a CPU threshold. That's why something's happening. What you really want to see is the anomaly, when it is strange, when it shouldn't be happening, to help you track down when there's an issue, so you can start going through the paper trail that we're starting to build, where you can start to determine where one of these security layers would have failed. So with VROPS, you're going to, in a vSphere cloud, either run it from the provider itself. That does make it easier for deployment. Many providers do give you VROPS as a service. We deploy it at the click of a button because it's a very easy automated piece, especially when you don't have an on-prem solution. Otherwise, you can also, and we would recommend as part of a best practice too, you can provision it on-prem. You can point it up to your cloud. All it needs is a vSphere API access to be able to start pulling some of those records down. Now, with a vCloud Director-based installation or with vCloud Air, you have a couple other options. vCloud Air, we do have a little bit of a special solution here where, as a former VMware service, we do have our own management pack that's free that ties into there, and it pulls metrics from vSphere from a host level up. It provides you with HCM migration and replication statistics. It provides you with NSX statistics, over 400 metrics that we have today out of that product. Now, there's a vCloud Director-based management pack that was just released recently as part of the VMware Service Provider Program. That provides today, I believe, about 40 metrics on a tenant-based capacity, and then they're going to scale it up over time to be able to give more and more. But where possible, from on-prem, you want to be monitoring from here, and all it needs is API access. That allows you to control while pointing in and watching what's happening on these servers. Now, of course, there are also systems-based monitoring solutions and other options you could bring in, but from a full host monitoring solution, if you're on a vSphere-based cloud, VROPS is going to be one of your best options. All right, so to illustrate this quick, we are getting a little low on time here. But the idea here is to follow the dot. So you can see when there's an issue. You can set in by default, it would be set to show you alerts when it is an anomaly versus when it's a common problem. And you can click down system by system with heat maps to point out very clearly in red. It's the old adage is follow the red dot through the system as you see those errors down to see exactly where it's happening from what's going on, so you can isolate down to the system. Now, in this case, we see that it's on a VM, so we can track that VM. We could go back from this solution to login site to search for that VM to see what other strange behaviors or access or other items might have happened there. We can check our systems down the line through our layers to make sure that we feel safe. So to loop back around on this, from an audit logging, from a systems monitoring, from an archival perspective, we're going to recommend a few solutions, and that's going to be VROPS from that anomaly detection and monitoring. That's going to be Log Insight from a log archival monitoring and searching capability. That is going to be vRealize Automation that provides both governments from higher level and some user access control, security, and guarantees from there, along with some of that audit logging of the actions in the environment. That then you can back up all of those systems to have further logs and further trails to be able to follow all these actions. On top of that, again, going back, we have our system security, our network security, and some of our RBAC recommendations that we've made so far. All of these compatible with both vSphere hosted clouds and VCD-based hosted clouds. So to illustrate this a little bit better, it always helps me with the diagram, so we're going to touch on a diagram here just quickly. So with what we built to provide some of these demos to look at here, and an SDDC-based cloud, of course, you have the vSphere API and your SDDC-based cloud on the right-hand side. We have your on-premise private side on the left. If you look on the bottom left, we'll have some of our installed solutions there. So with network security, we're going to be providing that in the cloud through NSX because you want a native local solution. That's not something you can keep on-prem, really. You want it up in the cloud, and that needs to be a little bit more distributed than some of the other solutions are. From an encryption and a system security perspective and compliance perspective, we're going to have high trust as our recommendation. That's going to be both contained on-prem and in the cloud from that cluster configuration in an HA type of mode to ensure that your VMs can be decrypted when they're supposed to be in those locations. One thing we didn't talk about here is they do have geofencing and other capabilities to make sure that these can only be accessed by the right users in the right way and the right location to be able to add additional security, but that gets a little bit beyond the complexity of what we can really dive into today. From a governance perspective, we're going to offer vRealize Automation as our primary, again, usually deployed on-prem from a resource requirement and from a licensing perspective, and then pointed up at the cloud because all it needs is API access. And it does have endpoint definitions and plugin definitions for VCD and vSphere to be able to automate, control that, and do your audit logging and everything else. For monitoring, we'll do VROPS. You can either use that as a service, or in this case, you can use it from on-prem as well. There is a bit of an option here. Either can work. We'll typically lean a little bit more towards the on-prem configuration, but it depends on what works best for you from a licensing and price comparison perspective. There are instances where it may be cheaper to run it as a service in a cloud on a VMware service provider sort of pricing versus buying a whole instance on-prem. And so in that case, if it's a pricing conversation, I'd lean towards get it and use it in the cloud rather than try to save money and don't get it at all. And then from a logging perspective, we'll of course go back to Log Insight, which can be multi-platform with that archival, with that searching and all of that you can centralize as needed.
So for VCD, the solution is actually quite similar to vSphere as a service. Once again, we have microsegmentation for network security. So that's up here. Then we have high trust to provide encryption of the VMs. We have VRA to deploy VMs and to provide governance. We have VROps to gather performance metrics. And we have Log Insight with a helper VM to get the logs.
Now the interesting point there is that both of those diagrams look almost the same. So if you're using these sorts of universal solutions that are compatible with multiple cloud types, especially if you're running on vSphere-based hosted clouds, this allows you to spread out again to the regions, to the providers that you want. There's dozens out in the Solutions Exchange, especially we can pitch our own here, to be able to hit the needs that you have and be able to scale out with a solution that you can contain in one location, but you can point to these instances to pull down your control and follow what you can and be able to meet that compliance need from the same general architecture with the same general tools. All right, so we have just a few minutes left to very quickly go through a scenario or two here just to show them off.
Okay, so in scenario one, we basically have a rogue admin that's going to change stuff into both environments. So the admin is going to change the network of a single VM and delete a distributed firewall rule. So the main idea here is to show you what's the actual difference in logging between vSphere and VCD. So we can see that a user has changed the networking policy. So the network to which a VM is connected to. Now he's going to go to NSX. He's going to delete a firewall rule.
Now the unfortunate part here is that you can't always stop an admin. Admin needs control, so this is one of the most common types of attacks.
Okay, and with a vSphere-based cloud, you can actually see that in logs. So you open NSX logs, and you can see that somebody has deleted a firewall rule at a specific time. So now all of the logs that we've seen in vCenter, we can also see them in Log Insight. So we are just going to show for a particular VM. So we can go check logs by a specific VM, click on a VM name, and we can see who did the change at what time. Now if we move on to VCD-based cloud, same action, same rogue admin. He's going to change the network on a specific VM. Now you'll be able to see that this action will be seen in the logs. So admin goes in, changes the network. Okay. So if we go now to check this in the logs, we can see that this action logged into UI. And it will also be logged into Log Insight because we are pulling the logs from here. But there is a major change in the distributed firewall. So if an admin deletes a rule in a distributed firewall, there is nowhere that you can see that in VCD because what we are using is a portal that's not part of VCD. So VCD doesn't actually know that there was a change made. So as you can see, the firewall was deleted, but the action is not logged in anywhere. And just to show you again the change on the VM in Log Insight, we're going to check that as well. So you can log into Log Insight, search for VM modify, and we can get the log there. So here it is.
Now this is one of those instances where again it's very tough to be able to prevent something like this from happening. There are some ways if you really want to restrict access way down at lower levels, but for most environments that would be too much. So from here we're going to recommend to have the mitigation systems, the audit trail in multiple systems so that you can sort of track this down and start to see, especially when things like vSphere and VCD logs roll. And providers get to determine how long they're going to keep those logs and what that's going to look like versus the user because they're managing that section of the environment. And they may or may not, depending on the provider, even give you some of the lower level access to see or control some of that. I believe there was a question in the back. In that case, if it is running through vCloud Director, there should be an action. Now, the case is that it likely isn't as descriptive as you would want it to be. So you could pull it out. You should see an action for something along those lines because they are taking a network action. But historically, they haven't described very much about the application, at least in the portal. Now, if you pull it out of the API, I'm not definitely sure. I haven't worked that deeply with the newest version of it, but based on the old structure and what they've done historically, I believe that in the new one, yes, there should be.
So you won't see the actual onto which network it was connected to, but you will see that the NIC was modified.
Now this is where the Yeah, with the firewall rule deletion, it would come up as there was a configuration change on the edge. Typically is how VCD would report it. Now to be able to pull out more detail, you can, in our cloud, there is a syslog setting that you can get to be able to push syslogs directly from the NSX device or the edges themselves over to a syslog server. So the recommendation would be from there, or you can configure log insight in certain providers' clouds to be able to pull from the NSX API where that's available. But some of them do hide the manager, so you don't have access to get there, and you may not have full access to some of the edges either. So where possible, yes, control as much of that where you can to pull out that type of information. But that's also where it's good when you can to lean on something like vRealize automation, where in that anything as a service, that XAAS catalog, you can configure that to be able to control those actions in scripts rather than provide them full access to the portal, so you can audit log them from there and control the access and the changes from that level as well.
So we'll need to skip the next one.
Yeah, in this case, we did have one other demo that was more focused on vRealize automation. For the sake of time, we are going to skip that. We've talked, I think, enough about that product. And I'd rather wrap up and leave time for greater Q&A here. So just to run back through, we've covered multiple layers of security. We've covered them in a centralized solution. We've done it with VMware and, in some cases, third-party products to provide you with the centralized control for hosted clouds, and we vetted that all of these are available on hosted cloud solutions, especially on our own. So these are proven running in production environments that we have put in place and configured, so we can guarantee you that all of this works. So with that, we do know now that high security is possible. There are tools, there are methods, there are some guidelines to follow. And even though a provider manages half the stack, and actually, even though with this too, there is a common misconception that clouds are natively less secure than on-prem environments, we can show that we do have ways to manage this, and in many cases it can be more secure than on-prem environments because they will be pushing for more versions of compliance and security than you may be in your on-prem environment. Now there is still shared security models. So there are some levels where you do have to manage some elements of your own environment, but you can lean on the provider to provide the physical security, the redundancy, some of the back-end logging, things like anti-DDoS mitigation, and other items and ways at scale that you may not be able to as smaller companies or providers. And then VMware has tools and utilities. Now this isn't VMware tools, but VMware has tools and utilities that can help simplify some of this, especially because you're staying within the ecosystem. So for the best integration, it's best to stay within the ecosystem. Where necessary, there are some third-party solutions that do provide some greater feature sets. There are some of those on the Solutions Exchange, or we showed one off today. There are some items where you can go outside that boundary, but typically it's easy to stay within the same ecosystem and family. With that, I'd like to finish up. Again, please fill out the surveys. Surveys are very important to us. That helps us to improve year after year and provide better sessions to you from our company, from our staff. Then we'd like to end with some Q&A. So we have just a few minutes left here. If there's no public Q&A, then we can always stay at the stand for a few minutes afterwards and try to answer any questions you may have in private as well. Thank you. As a follow-up, we do have a booth too if you have more questions later on that you think of. Our staff can help with that. All right, are there any follow-up questions?
Can VRealize capture security and logging events down to the OS level?
Which version of VRealize? So you want security, the question is, can VRealize capture security and logging events down to
the OS layer?
The OS layer.
Oh, hello. Hi.
There's the microphone.
Right, so my question was, you're keeping records there of
Yes.
an audit trail of an administrator making some changes on a NIC within the VM, but can the audit team also go down to the OS layer so that the administrator also goes in on the console, logs into Windows, makes a change on the network adapter there? Can that be traced back?
Yes, there are some solutions for that. We didn't go into depth on OS-based solutions here because there is a very wide market for it. VMware, I believe that would be more TrustPoint, and Tanium would provide some configuration control to make sure that they couldn't change those settings, or if they do, they are very quickly changed back, and you can track some of those differences in the environment. Then from a logging perspective, you do have some other options to be able to export logs to Log Insight in a similar method from Windows. There are some built-in syslog options, but that is a huge volume to work with. Now, it's easier to search through with something like Log Insight, but there is a lot to work with there. Off the top of my head, I don't know if I have much more to provide, just because we focused more on a high level of security rather than individual OS. Do you have anything, Rock?
No, because what if you would change it from vRealize with day 2 operations, that will probably be seen, right? If you would change a NIC from vRealize for an agent, but
now there was.
If you would do it inside, I don't see how.
I am spacing on the name of it. There is a product that works from VMware in
Tanium?
conjunction, not Tanium, but with vRealize operations to do more of a systems level monitoring and control. If you give me a minute, hopefully I'll remember.
Manager?
No, it's actually a system level agent install that we've had for a long time. It's one of the smaller products. VMware does have something for it. If someone remembers a name, they can share, but I'll need a minute to think about that, and if not, I can get it after. I can search for it quickly.
I think there was another question in the back.
Yes, question in the back.
Going back to the encryption part, is it covering only when a VM is traveling from the cloud to another environment, or is covering also a part where the VMs on different environments are exchanging data?
So it's basically that's encryption and rest. So when you encrypt it, it's when they're exchanging data, right? You will need to use SSL or whatever it is on the networking layer to encrypt that traffic. But when the traffic hits the VM, it gets automatically encrypted. So it's not when it's traveling between the VMs. For that you have other solutions. But when it hits the VM, it will automatically get encrypted. Okay. Anything else? Cool. Thanks, everybody.
Great. We'll stay up here for a few minutes. Thank you.